This video is the first of a three-part series exploring the dangers and challenges of space travel. At the bottom of the sea floor, pressures can range from 3,000 to 9,000 pounds per square inch, enough to crumple most animals, including humans, into small clumps of meat. And yet, under these extreme pressures, life still exists. Deep-sea creatures have been shaped by their environment to survive under pressures that would crush a mid-sized sedan. Likewise, our bodies are adapted to survive under the pressure of our own atmosphere. At sea level, the weight of all the molecules of air above us press down on our bodies in the same way that thousands of feet of water press down on deep-sea fish. Our bodies are adapted to live with this 14.7 pounds of pressure per square inch surrounding us. This means that our bodies exert an equivalent 14.7 pounds of pressure outwards, keeping our bodies shaped and operating properly. But what happens if we take a deep-sea fish and bring it to the surface of the ocean? Well, they would explode. The 3,000 to 9,000 pounds of pressure inside their bodies would rapidly expand outwards. Likewise, if we were to be suddenly released into the vacuum above us, the same thing that happened to those deep-sea fish would happen to us. We would die. The vacuum of space is lethal to human beings and any other form of life on Earth that is accustomed to the atmospheric pressure we all know and love. So, what happens to our bodies when they are exposed to this vacuum of space? And how do we prevent those non-ideal side effects of rapid decompression from interfering with our goals of galactic domination? Well, the first thing we need to do is conquer the pressure differential. Never mind the lack of oxygen or extreme temperatures, we can tackle that issue when we come to it. A lack of oxygen might kill you in minutes, but a vacuum will kill you in seconds. So how do we survive the vacuum of space? Well, ironically enough, the same way that we would survive the immense pressures of the deep sea works to survive the pressures of space. We need a pressure vessel. Spacecraft, like submarines, maintain a livable atmosphere for the crew by creating a pressure boundary between the nice and comfy 14.7 psi and the hard vacuum of space. But if you were stranded in space without a spacesuit or spacecraft to protect you, what would happen? Well, the sudden pressure drop would cause several things to happen to your body. For starters, don't hold your breath. Seriously, if for some reason you find yourself in a vacuum, you should blow all of the air out of your lungs, like right now. If you don't empty your lungs, then the atmospheric pressure of the air inside your lungs will have nothing pressing back against them. Now suddenly your body is pushing outwards with 14.7 pounds per square inch, which is enough to really, really hurt. If you're quick on your feet and resist the urge to take one last breath before all the air is sucked away from you, you're not out of the fire just yet. Just because the air from your lungs has been successfully evacuated without killing you, doesn't mean the water and air in your cells won't be affected. Fun fact, the boiling point of water is dependent on pressure, and in a vacuum, even room temperature water would boil. So if you survive your lungs popping, get ready because next up is 60% of your body flash boiling due to the lack of pressure holding the water molecules together. Yeah, not a pleasant way to go. So how do spacecraft maintain this pressure boundary? Well, it doesn't take a lot of material to make a spacecraft's walls strong enough to keep out the vacuum of space. For example, the lunar lander used in the Apollo missions had a wall thickness of only 0.012 inches. About 3 times the thickness of your average soda can. The walls of the lander weren't strong enough to support their own weight, so the skin of the lander was made rigid due to its own internal pressure, a lot like a metallic balloon. The skin was also very puncture resistant and would bend and deform before tearing, so it doesn't take a lot of material to make a sufficiently strong pressure boundary in space. The power of the vacuum of space is largely oversold in science fiction and popular media as this immense and destructive force, when in reality 15 psi really is not that much of a pressure differential. In our everyday lives we encounter a larger pressure differential all the time. In the tires of your cars, in household vacuum cleaners, and even in soda cans you can see large pressure differentials comparable to the vacuum of space. Yes, it's a serious threat, but it is not a hard one to defeat, since it only takes a few layers of aluminum foil to keep the vacuum out. But there is another factor to the vacuum of space that spacecraft must deal with to keep their crews safe. We've tackled how to keep the vacuum out, but temperature regulation is a whole lot more complicated out in space than here on Earth. It's not exactly like you can throw open a window and get some circulation in your spacecraft if it gets a little toasty. and air conditioning units like you might have in your home don't exactly work in the same way either. Thermal management is a massive field in spacecraft design. In general, there are 3 different ways to transfer heat: through conduction of heat through a material, the convection of heat by a moving fluid, or the radiation of heat through, well, radiation. In an atmosphere, conduction and convection are responsible for almost all heat transfer. Radiative heat transfer requires extremely high temperature differentials to be an effective way to transfer heat. But in space, with no air blowing over the skin of your spaceship, there is really no way to carry that extra thermal energy through convection or conduction. Without a way to remove thermal energy, everything in a spacecraft that uses power, including lights, the bodies of astronauts, and even the sunlight that hits the surface of the spacecraft, will slowly increase the temperature inside. So how do spacecraft get rid of all that excess heat? Well, we can reflect a lot of the radiative heat from the sun away from our spacecraft using insulation. Not the pink fuzzy kind your parents told you not to touch because it's made of fiberglass, but essentially a very shiny metallic foil. Shiny surfaces act like mirrors to radiative heat, reflecting it away from the spacecraft and keeping it cooler. The insulating material used on the International Space Station is a aluminized mylar, which is a flexible, durable material with a very shiny silver surface. This insulation helps prevent the extra heat from the sun from being added to the station, but we need to remove the heat that is being generated inside the craft as well. Enter the radiator. Inside the spacecraft are heat exchangers that work the same way that your refrigerator does. Water or a liquid ammonia is pumped through the tubes in the heat exchanger, absorbing the heat from inside the spacecraft. The water is then pumped into the radiators, large arrays of panels exposed to the vacuum of space. These panels absorb the heat from the water and radiate it out into space, removing the heat from your craft. This process can be controlled by changing the rate that the liquid is pumped through the panels, allowing you to manually adjust the temperature and humidity inside your spacecraft. While we might not think about temperature initially when thinking about the dangers of space travel, if there is no way to control the temperature of a spacecraft, it can put the entire crew in real danger. The United States' first space station, Skylab, was almost ended due to thermal control issues. Skylab was damaged during deployment when the meteoroid shield was ripped loose, causing the number 2 solar array to be ripped off and the number 1 solar array to be partially opened. Without proper electrical power, and without the metallic meteorite shield, which doubled as an insulation barrier, Skylab was not able to regulate its heat, and the internal temperatures inside the station rose to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. If NASA wanted to complete Skylab's mission and send a crew up to the station, then they would need to reduce the temperature. The flight controllers were able to save Skylab by sending commands to the station, pointing it end-on towards the sun. By pointing the station at the sun instead of having it broad to the sun, they were able to limit the amount of sunlight hitting the station. The installation of a parasol to shield the station from additional sunlight was able to further reduce the temperatures on board to the point that astronauts were able to board and live on Skylab. So we can keep the vacuum out by creating a pressure boundary between our crew and the emptiness of space, and we can keep the temperature inside our spacecraft at comfortable levels using radiators and insulation. But how do we provide enough oxygen for the crew during their missions? On average, you breathe about 2,000 gallons of air a day. Air on Earth is a mix of 78% nitrogen, 20% oxygen, and about 1% argon. The air we breathe out is about 15% oxygen, so 5% of the air that we breathe every day is used by our bodies to fuel our cells. 5% of 2,000 gallons comes out to 100 gallons of oxygen at standard temperature and pressure. On Earth, we have an almost infinite amount of air to breathe, and trees and plants to convert the CO2 we exhale back into breathable oxygen. But on a spacecraft, the air is limited, and systems need to be put in place to regulate the air astronauts breathe on their missions. Extra oxygen tanks need to be brought on the mission. These tanks contain liquid oxygen, which is much denser than oxygen we breathe, so lots of breathable air can be stored in a small volume. But we also need a way to remove the excess carbon dioxide we exhale as a result of our metabolic processes. CO2 scrubbers can be used to chemically remove the excess CO2 from the atmosphere of the spacecraft, and air filters can be used to maintain the quality of the air inside. These systems regulate the composition of the air in a spacecraft, keeping it breathable and clean, and allowing the astronauts to live comfortably while in space. With all of these different systems in place to regulate the pressure, temperature, and atmospheric composition inside a spacecraft, astronauts can travel to space without fear of dying horrible, painful deaths. While these are not the only dangers of space travel, they are the most immediate and limiting threats that have to be solved first before we can send any living beings into space. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. My name is DeltLead, and I hope you found it informative and entertaining. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and a comment, stay safe out there, and keep on building.